Wallace rightly thought that selection favors whatever works in the here and now, and it doesn't look into the future. But there's sort of an interesting twist to it, which is that he was trying to understand how it is that we could have advanced abilities like we heard from mathematics and philosophy and music if none of these things would have been useful in evolutionarily ancient lineage of man. And in particular, what makes it interesting is that unlike many of the other Victorian scientists, Wallace thought that what were referred to as primitive societies of that day also possessed these abilities, even though they themselves had no particular use for them. They would not provide any function for them. And what I'm going to try and do is smash what we might think of as this white picket fence that Wallace put around human consciousness, the human mind. So let me just start with a couple of quotes that, again, make us familiar with the basic argument that Wallace is making about why we have to turn to other things, in part spiritualism, to explain the human consciousness and the human mind. Those facilities which enable us to transcend time and space to realize the wonderful conceptions of mathematics and philosophy are evidently essential to the perfect development of man as a spiritual being, but they are utterly inconceivable as being produced through the action of a law, which looks only and can only look to the immediate material welfare of the individual or the race. This utilitarian hypothesis, which is the theory of natural selection applied to humans, seems inadequate to account for the developments of our own moral sense. If we look to primitive societies of that day, and if we think about more evolutionarily ancient lineages that led to modern-day humans, they possess a mental organ which is beyond their needs. And here again is the problem for Wallace and why he turns to other explanations. What I want to do today is, not being an expert on Wallace per se, but rather being someone who spends a lot of time thinking about animal behavior, is take what we know now about the sort of things that non-humans are capable of and just pose the question, would Wallace have thought differently about building this little white picket fence around the human mind if he knew what we know now? So I'm not making the mistake of saying he should have known by any sense what was going to happen 100 years later, but rather would he perhaps have taken a different path when it comes to understanding natural selection and the human mind if he had an understanding of the sorts of things that we now know that non-humans are capable of. And to do that, I'm going to walk you through very quickly a number of different behavioral examples that might make us rethink and perhaps might make Wallace rethink what he said. So we'll look at some work on altruism in non-humans. We'll look at some work on morality and fairness in non-humans. We'll look at some work on empathy. We'll look at some work on culture, teaching, and if we have time, we'll do a little bit on planning for the future. So the first of these, altruism, is one that has been studied extensively by animal behaviorists ever since Darwin's Origin of Species, and before that, people have been thinking about this problem. And this is the one that I think most of you might be most familiar with, is this work on altruism in non-humans. And what I'm going to try and do each time I put up an example is to give you a quote or a snippet from Wallace to make you think, well, maybe if we knew about altruism and record keeping then, what we know now, the white picket fence would not have been built in the first place. I myself have been working on altruism and this sort of thing for a long time. Many, many people have. I'm not going to talk about my own work. Instead, I'm just going to give you one example of this kind of altruism and record keeping in non-humans. And this deals with mobbing behavior in birds. So this is something you see in dozens of species of birds. What happens is they spot something that's potentially dangerous, like this owl here, and the prey species, typically much smaller, a bunch of them together, may come up, approach, do all sorts of screaming and nasty things towards that potential predator to make it go away. And we refer to that typically as mobbing behavior. Now, the way that altruism comes into play here is that it looks like what happens is animals are keeping track of who helps them when they need assistance in terms of mobbing a predator, and then reciprocating that act of altruism when it's necessary. So let me show you a quick little experiment here. Here's some work that was done by Krams and on the pied flycatchers, and it's a nice little experimental setup. Here's a nest box that has a pair of pied flycatchers. Here's an owl, potential predator, and so what'll generally happen is the animals will mob. And the way that this experiment was set up was that there's 3 of these nests, 1, 2, and 3, right? And so the owl is put near nest 1. So they're in the most danger. They'll come out and begin to mob. The question is, what else happens? Well, the experiment is set up so that the birds at nest 3 could, and in fact usually do, come out and help by mobbing as well, even though it's not as big a danger to them because the owl's a little bit further away. But the birds in nest box 2 have been caged up by the investigator, so they cannot join in the mobbing themselves. And the follow-up to this is to ask, well, if these birds were helped by these birds when they needed it, but not by these, do they remember who was good to them, and do they reciprocate that act of goodness in the future? So phase 2 of the experiment releases the owl, right, near nest 3, okay, or near nest 2. And when the owl is placed near nest 2, those birds from nest 1 who were helped by these birds in nest 3, I'm sorry if I said 2, 3 here, if the owl is placed near 3, then the birds in 1 who were helped by the birds in 3 come and mob that owl. But if the owl is placed near box 2, in which this pair was not allowed to help pair 1, then when they need help, pair 1 does not do anything. They keep track of who helps who, and then when the opportunity arises to reciprocate, they often do. But we can look deeper down than kind of classic record keeping and altruism. And we can look at things like morality and fairness. Certainly one of the things that Wallace is always making indirect or direct reference to when he builds this white picket fence around the human mind and human consciousness. What I want to do is show you a clip from some amazing work that many of you might have seen this. I note that it has 2 million hits on YouTube. It's excerpted from Frans de Waal's TED Talk. This is work that Frans did with Sarah Brosnan, who spent some time in my laboratory as well. And they wanted to look at morality and fairness in capuchin monkeys. And I'm going to, in a second, put the tape on and let Frans tell you exactly what's happening. But let me just set it up for you, because he talks quickly, and it happens even, well, so do I, but at least you'll have twice now. The setup here goes like this. There are these 2 capuchins, one's over here and one's over here. And the basic idea here is that the capuchins have been trained already by this time that if they hand the investigator, Sarah, a little wooden token, they'll get a piece of food in return. And they've been trained to know that sometimes that food, it will be a grape, which they really like, and sometimes it'll be a cucumber, which is okay, but they don't like it as much as grapes. Okay? So just remember that. They really like grapes. They like cucumbers okay, but not as much as grapes. And to get that piece of food, they've already learned that they just have to hand Sarah a little wooden token. Now watch what happens and think about what this tells us in terms of sort of morality and fairness in non-humans.
Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens.
Okay.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape.
Which they like.
And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber.
Which she doesn't like. Okay. And look at this. And this is not just one little video clip that happened once that he captured and is using to explain everything, right? This happened over and over again. This idea,
now,
right, that the capuchin.
She needs to give it to us.
I'll let Frans finish one.
Again.
Here it is again, just in case you didn't believe it. Okay. So a cucumber is perfectly fine to get if you give a token in and you don't see anybody else getting better for that token. But if you see another individual get a grape for the same thing that you just gave that token in for, all of a sudden, that is cheating. That is not playing by the rules, and the food gets thrown back in their face. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about empathy. Another one of the things that either indirectly or directly Wallace was thinking about when he built this white picket fence. Okay, and I'm going to show you some work that was done on empathy, and I will say beforehand, this is about as far as I'm willing to stretch interpretations of animal behavior, but it was either a Nature or a Science paper. It garnered a lot of attention. I think it raises an interesting way to study empathy in non-humans. So we've done a little bit on birds, we've done a little bit on primates. Here's an experiment on empathy in mice. Okay, and it was a science paper. You can see the reference down here. And here's the basic setup. There's two mice. There's this mouse out here, and then his little buddy, who's unfortunately for him stuck in this plastic canister in the middle that has a door that can be opened if you try hard enough and figure it out. And the question is whether or not the free mouse here will do anything at all to try and release its partner in here. So it's not a partner in the sense that they've had lots of interactions together when the experiment starts, but it's just another mouse that's stuck in there, clearly in a very, very uncomfortable position. The box is not much bigger than the individual inside of it. It's squirming around. It doesn't like it in there. What happens?
Put a free rat, the rat with the black dot on his head, into an arena, and in the center is his cage mate trapped in a plexiglass restrainer. The door to the restrainer can only be opened from the outside by the free rat. Here you're seeing the first 5 minutes sped up on the first day of testing. Even though it takes quite a bit of rat courage to venture into the scary arena center, the free rat persists in moving to the center and trying to figure this restrainer thing out so he can help his cage mate.
Maybe.
So now in this clip, the rats have been in this paradigm several times. This is the 5th day of testing. And we're viewing the session in real time, but after 25 minutes have elapsed. What you see is that the free rat is very focused on the door. You will see him open the door for the first time in a moment. What I want you to notice is that the free rat freezes. He freezes because the door falls over, and since it's the first time he's opened the door, he's surprised and he startles by freezing at the sound of the falling door. There he goes.
The door just fell.
Now, after a brief exploration of the strange land of the restrainer, the liberated rat runs around exploring the arena. Wherever the liberated rat goes, the free rat follows, jumping on and licking him. For about 5 to 10 minutes, this apparent celebration continues, with the free rat very active and always in close proximity to his liberated cage mate.
Okay, so I wouldn't automatically use the kind of language that was used in that video. I'm not sure how joyful they are. I do know that this is repeated many times, and the animals show this as a pattern, freeing their partner. And the interesting thing is that they don't open up the door to that canister if there's no other mouse inside there. If I said rat, I'm sorry. Oh, I wrote it again. Sorry about that. They don't open up the canister if there's a toy mouse in there that's not doing things that a mouse does when they're stuck in a little plastic box. They do open the canister even if they can't interact with the freed rat after the rat has been freed. They'll, in subsequent interactions, still free that rat, even if they don't get a chance, and they now learn that they won't get a chance to interact with it afterwards. And in some ways, to me, the most interesting thing, if the rat is put in a slightly modified setup here, where one of its little compadres is stuck inside the box, and there's another box that again has a door, but it has chocolate in it, which the mice love to eat. In a good chunk of the trials, they choose to free their partner before they open up the door to get the food, which if there was nobody else around, they would do immediately. And then they share the food with the rat that's been freed. I don't know if that's empathy exactly, but it's something like it. Let me talk to you just a little bit about culture in non-humans, again, with this idea of maybe the white picket fence isn't really necessary. Here's a quick video of one example I'm sure you know very well. In chimpanzees, they're basically cracking open the nuts by smashing on them with sticks. And the reason that this is cultural is that it is something that individuals learn when they're young by watching older adults. And there have been tons of studies on this in many different sites across Africa. And in fact, right, there are many things. All of these things are behaviors that chimpanzees learn culturally by watching when they're younger what adults do and then doing it when they mature. Here's one of my favorites. This is a hand clasp. This is something that they often do after some bout of aggression. It's a kind of reconciliation. And again, we know that they learn this in part by watching adults from their population when they're young. But the beautiful thing about the chimpanzee work on culture is that there are 6 major sites that have been studied across Africa, in many cases for 3, 4, 5 decades of chimpanzee work. And people have documented the presence or absence of these cultural varieties across these populations. So what I did here was I highlighted in red. You can see in these 3 populations, you see the hand clasp. But if you go to the other 3 populations, and sometimes they're next to a population where they do show a hand clasp, you don't see hand clasps. This is kind of a classic pattern that you expect with cultural transmission. For whatever reason, individuals pick it up and learn it in a population. And in other populations, they don't. Sometimes those populations could be right next to each other. Maybe they pick it up because someone comes in from one of those other populations, but some populations do it and some don't. And that's true for virtually all of the, whatever there are, 35 cultural behavioral variants that you see in the chimpanzees. Again, maybe we think about the white picket fence a little bit different. Teaching, another cognitively sophisticated thing that animals do that might make us rethink a white picket fence. There's not as many examples of teaching in the literature as some of the other things we talked about. Let me tell you one of my favorites, because this incorporates both teaching and tool use in non-humans. And this comes from work on bottlenose dolphins that Janet Mann at Georgetown has done. And what these bottlenoses do is, they have to forage often in gravelly bottoms or off sharp rocks, and they're basically trying to get fish out by pounding down, right? And that really hurts the snout. So what they do is they search around often for 10 minutes to find the perfectly sized sponge to put over their snout so that when they go down and look for those fish that are hidden in the gravel or in the sand or whatever, they don't hurt themselves. Animals will look for just the right size sponge. Janet has found that they do this she's documented this more than 1,000 times, right? As soon as it works and they kick something out of the gravel, they chase after it and then they go back and they get their sponge. And there's some evidence that because of the way this is inherited through the female lineage rather than males, there's some evidence that young individuals who often spend 4 or 5 years with their mother before they leave, learn how to do this kind of sponge diving by watching their mother. And there's other examples of teaching in non-humans as well. And again, all of this is to sort of say whether or not these things that seem very complicated, that maybe were involved in Wallace thinking, well, humans can do this sort of thing, and it's hard to explain it by natural selection. Well, it's not so hard if you in fact find it in other species as well. 2 more quick examples, and then I'll wrap up. Deception theory of mind. Okay? Let me show you some really nice work that was done by Nikki Clayton and her group at Cambridge on food storing in these western scrub jays. Okay, so here they are, they're about to start, the jays in general and the scrub jays in particular can often bury down thousands of pieces of food that they'll retrieve throughout the year. And if you watch them, that's what they do. They put them down in the ground, and then they have astounding memory to find these things. But more interesting is how they respond when there are others around who might try and do something nasty like steal their food. So if there's a scrub jay around and it's burying its food, it behaves very, very differently if there's another scrub jay around watching. First of all, the birds tend to try and cache their food in areas that are kind of hidden, that aren't out in the most obvious place. That might have something to do with trying to keep it away from others, but maybe not. Right? But what Nikki found was that if a scrub jay that has just cached something, buried it under the ground, if it interacts with another scrub jay that wasn't around when it buried, no problem. If it interacts with a scrub jay who was there and looking while it buried, then things can get very aggressive. The individual who buried it responds differently. They're much more aggressive towards someone who's seen them. And perhaps most remarkably, I think, is that when they bury their food and somebody is watching them, oftentimes what they do is return back to where they were when that observer isn't around anymore, dig it out, and go hide it someplace else. And the most incredible part of that is they only do that if they themselves have been thieves. So if they have gone around and done that, then they act differently, and they know the possibility that this other individual may do it to them, and they dig it up when that individual isn't there, and they go and bury it somewhere else. Again, suggesting a kind of primitive theory of mind that you can put yourself into the position of others and predict what they're going to do, in part based on your view, your own experience, plus various other sophisticated kind of cognitive tricks that you can do. And finally, let me just tell you about one more study that Nikki Clayton did with, I believe these were scrub jays as well, and deals with planning for the future. This is one of the few studies on this in non-humans, and it may be the only study in non-primates. So what Clayton and Rabi and their lab did was they set these birds up in the laboratory, and they basically had two places they could feed, and they had sort of learned through this elaborate lab protocol that sometimes there would be food over on this side, and sometimes there would be food over on this side, okay? And the food was ground up so that it could not be stored. It was the kind of thing that you just had to eat right then and there, and the birds have been trained to understand that the left side sometimes is going to have food in some trials, and the right side is going to have food in other trials. Right? Then, all of a sudden, they give the birds a food source that can be hidden, cached down, in this case in this, in this ice cube tray that has little gravel in it so that you can hide it. Now the question is, what do the scrub jays do? Well, what they do is they bury their food in the ice tray with gravel in it on the side where they're expecting there to be no food based on what they learned in the earlier trials. Right? And in addition, Clayton and Rabi and their team did another experiment where, in fact, instead of having the food canister be either empty or full when they were being trained, they had it with one food type, or type 1 food and type 2 food. And they did the same sort of experiment, and then what they saw was what the birds did was when they were given the chance to cache food, to hide it in this part of the setup, they tended to put whatever food was unlikely to be in the side they were going to there. So if they were expecting peanuts on the right side, right, and they got peanuts to cache, they would often put it on the left side where maybe they were getting some other bird seed. And vice versa. They were potentially planning for the future in terms of diversifying their diet. It is often that when we actually ask the question in the right way, we find that in non-humans, many of the things that we thought were uniquely human are not, in fact, uniquely human. And so I think that's sort of one of the lessons. And then that's an important lesson for the Wallace thing because he viewed that problem of these kind of sophisticated things that we do as a unique problem to humans. If the sample size he had was not just humans, but tons of other species, many of which display at least rudimentary forms of what we're talking about, then maybe the problem goes away. So I don't think it's a problem. I don't think that the fundamental difference is that there are things that we uniquely do. There may be a few, okay? But for the most part, when we look, we find that if we ask the question in an ecologically and evolutionarily relevant way, that make sense for the selection pressures the animals were under, we often find they're capable of things that we thought were uniquely human. And I'm not a Wallace expert, I'm an animal behavior expert, and I really appreciate you giving me a few minutes to talk about this. I know we're running late, so let me stop here and thank you for listening.